In 1988, I was working for the Navy using ARPANET and designing electronics for various naval avionics applications. And a writer wrote a novel that had some uncomfortable predictions for the future. I'm Mark Harris, the unretired engineer, engineering tech, and the occasional uncomfortable question. Stick around. So Marc Stiegler wrote David's Sling in 1988. It's pre-GPS, really, pre-internet, but it has stuck around with me ever since because it tied together many things that I was seeing in my job at that time as a young engineer and some themes that ran into the future and that have really been stimulated just about every year ever since. It called AI targeting, autonomous air and ground vehicles, and distributed robotic manufacturing. It called it all, and it dealt with some of the ethical issues that those things bring. But it saw it in a political world that was very different from ours. Only a few months after the novel was published, the Soviet Union, which was the antagonist in the novel, collapsed and showed how much of a hollow threat it had been in many ways. And so I think a lot of people kind of maybe dismissed the book, but Stanley Schmidt of Analog Magazine said that at the time that it should be essential reading for a lot of politicians and military people, because I think he, as well as others, saw that it was pointing to a future which was highly likely. So the politics were wrong, but the engineering was right, and that tech that he predicted arrived anyway. So one of the things I think is very, very interesting is that the arc of the AI and drone warfare has been very similar to what happened with aviation in World War I. Essentially, recon first. Aviation was a huge gain in reconnaissance and justified huge expense on every side to generate vehicles which gave the generals the chance to do reconnaissance like they had never been able to do. And through the 80s and 90s, that was all building fast. It had really happened before, but it really was very obvious as a lot of the players built smaller and more specialized recon drones that would fit into tactical and operational as well as strategic roles. So it was very similar. But yeah, in those periods, you saw Lebanon, Syria, the whole Middle East, the Russian periphery, Turkey, everybody, drone usage was just off the charts. But it was mostly reconnaissance. And then it started to get sharp. First, you saw Reapers shooting Hellfire missiles and dropping lightweight bombs. But around the same time, you started to see that actors were just strapping a grenade onto a Mavic drone and sending it over the hill to bomb the people they'd spotted just before with the other Mavic when they did recon. So all actors all the time were basically progressing, and the dance in the drone AI warfare just started to build really fast. So unfortunately, Ukraine is the proof of concept. It's not a test range, not a simulation. This is really where it's happening. Drones mesh with AI direction at first with a human mediator, but more and more without that human mediator, more and more the drones doing it on their own. And then Russia leaned in with their weapons and their drones, and then Ukraine with their Western supporters leaned back in even harder, and rapid robotic assembly, fast innovation cycles, enemy move and counter move. Yeah, it all was very much a very kind of the way you could see it had happened in prior wars. It all accelerated very, very quickly. And then think about this, a year ago, two semi-trucks in the hinterlands of Russia filled with crates of autonomous drones. They pulled up, the crates emptied, and a large proportion of the strategic Air Force was damaged or destroyed, and the Russians had to pull back. Weapons that had been used occasionally for bombing campaigns in Ukraine, they had to pull them way back because they were now under threat in a way that they had not been before. This isn't really what Stiegler predicted, but it's very close in many, many ways, if particularly at the detail level. He had several tactical vignettes, which are eerily similar to things that you kind of heard about on the battlefield. So this is where it gets personal, and it's why I made this video. So part of the problem is that you can see the world changing around us, startups replacing the primes. Then you look beyond that, and it isn't even the startups who are doing some of this technology. It is somebody less than a startup. You look at Anduril and Shield; they're doing in months what the big old primes took decades to do, and they're doing it with relatively modest investment. Okay, and they're creating new arsenals with that money. And think about what would happen if the full US economy were plugged into that infrastructure. What they could turn out, and the timeframes are just staggering to think about if you spun up to the level that we did in World War I or World War II. And, part of this goes back to, at a lower level, the tools are on Amazon. The tools are in the prototyper manufacturers who can build almost anything for anyone if you give them the CAD drawing. And you can build the systems in a garage because, it's relatively simple technology, and it would be relatively easy to build hundreds of crates with weapons with very compact warheads delivered anywhere within a nation state swarming a target of choice. So, Skynet was fiction, but a garage and Amazon are real and real today. The barrier isn't technology; it's more the will to use it and then somewhat the ability to use it. This is something that the U.S. government and governments all over the world are looking at. They do understand this threat, and they're basically using the tools of the tools of spycraft to try and make sure that it doesn't get out of hand, to make sure the bad actors don't get their hands on the tools without being seen by the watchers. So, Terminator gave us the story we could win, but the real trajectory doesn't really work like that. Terminator, there was one enemy, one war, an identifiable target, and that was comfortable. Even in David's Sling, there was an identifiable antagonist, and the outcome was a little bit different, but it was really a similar happy story. But we're not living in the world of Skynet where it could take over the nuclear weapons and nuke the human race. We're not really living in Stiegler's world of David's Sling, where nation states are the only ones who have access to these tools. We're really in a world where the tools that we all see as giving us a huge and almost boundless ability to develop and move forward with technology and to improve our lives, we can see that turning into a nightmare that isn't Skynet. It's David's Sling in the wrong hands with no Goliath to aim it, a war of all against all. I'm Mark Harris, the unretired engineer. So more engineering, more uncomfortable questions next week. Cheers.